Hey everyone, this is video 0.0.3, which is a history of education in the United States. It says it's going to be brief, but that's hard to do. I've learned, so I might do this in two parts. I am going to time myself to try to keep it to 10 minutes. We'll see. And then I actually had to sort of change my focus. I realized it's really hard to do a brief history because those are sort of oxymorons. So I'm going to dive into what I have for you. It's really interesting to me. I think it kind of shapes how we got to how we do education now. And it kind of raises the question of, should we keep doing it this way based on how we got to where we are now? I'll show you, I had all these slides planned, but I'll pick up here to try to keep it brief because I found out it was just going to take a lot longer. Let me share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at. But yeah, I had all these slides and I'm like, oh, this is just going to take so long. So I picked up here. So let's dive on in. Now, what's in this video, a few things. A brief as possible explanation of education in the US. I'll try to give you context to how we got to this current structure of like, why do you go to school from 8 to 4? And why is it like elementary, middle, and high school? And why do you learn calculus in high school and stuff like that? And then this will lead into a vision of how we're going to learn this year and why I think it's a great idea. I actually won't cover that in this video for time's sake, but I will explain that in future videos. And I hope that this video gives you all some context as to why I think it's a really good idea to maybe try to learn a little differently. If you take away nothing else, like if you tune me out for the next whatever, please take away this, which is the way schools are set up has like nothing to do with them being the best way to teach and learn. What I mean is like people didn't sit around and say, all right, we know like all this research shows that like it's best to have kids in the same age. It's best to have them in elementary school for 5 years and middle school for 3 years. That's not why schools are set up the way they're set up. It's largely just by people battling interests, like what should be taught and how should it be taught, and just individuals making choices and everyone just kind of copying each other. That's a lot of coincidence. So it's not really tied to this is the best way to teach and learn. It's just tied to we've done this for so many years, and so we keep doing it. Here's my sources. If you're curious, you can just probably copy and paste or just type in the titles right there so you can pause the video to like see the sources. And then I have others that I list all throughout. So my overall goal is to try to educate you all and maybe like get you on board with me to sort of challenge the status quo we're in for education. Here are the questions that I'm trying to answer. How do we get to a school year that's about 9 to 10 months long with summers off? How do we get to what is taught? And then how do we get to this elementary, middle, high school structure where you're largely in classes with the same age classmates? So question 1, how do we arrive at the current length of a school year? So you're in 17th century USA. Now reminder, 17th century actually refers to the previous 100 years. So the 17th century is January 1st, 1601, all the way through December 31st, 1699. So that's the 17th century referring to the 1600s. Now what you have is, make sure I'm on the right slide, is education started in the colonies largely as a religious endeavor. So New England Puritans wanted to make sure everyone knew how to read the Bible. They began to enforce the reading of it through the Massachusetts-based school law of 1642. The directive removed education responsibilities from the clergy and required that parents teach their kids how to read and write. It failed horribly. It did not work out. And so they changed, they had a new law enacted, the Old Deluder Act of 1647, that to create order that every township, so every like town in this jurisdiction, after the Lord hath increased them to 50 households, once you have 50 households, shall with forth appoint one within their town to teach all such children as shall resort him to read, to write and read. So you kind of have the first establishment of this teacher when your population reaches a certain number. And that's actually the quote if you wanted to read it for yourself. And I included my source right down there if you're curious to read more about that. So a few things to answer question 1. So early education, largely religious based, and the 18th century, so now we're in the 1701 to 1799, there's a push to mass educate people. And in the 18th century, we have what are kind of referred to as common schools. Now, this is like a one-room schoolhouse where students usually worked with a teacher individually or in small groups. And also like students could just like skip school for long periods of time to like tend to crops and take care of their family duties, and didn't really learn a whole lot. Like you didn't really have to go to school. And a lot of students sort of, and families understood this, and they opted for like private lessons with tutors if they really wanted to be in the educated world and go on to college afterward. But we have common schools, all ages, all in kind of one space, sort of learning randomly. It's not really working super well. And so then in the 1800s, the 1830s, you have this sort of pop-up of what are referred to as Lancaster schools. I'm not sure how common the phrase Lancaster is, but I'll describe what I'm referring to. So this is like these old-fashioned rows where you have kids of all ages all packed into a pretty small schoolhouse. Now, a Lancaster type school would look different from anything we've been involved in. What's interesting is instead of being separated into different classrooms by grade or subject, students of all ages sat in rows in a single room, but they were separated by the mastery of certain subjects, which is like really, it was really status driven. So like you wanted to be near the front and you get like demoted and moved down back to the rows. And the idea was like it was a very high stakes system. But you were grouped by your mastery of subjects, not by your age, which I find interesting. Now the teacher or the headmaster taught monitors. Now a monitor is like a hallway monitor. Like they're just older kids that sort of like do what the headmaster or teacher tells them. In these schoolhouses, you could have like hundreds of kids, thousands to like one or two teachers and like monitors. So, like the ratio was crazy. And so these monitors were basically in charge of everything. They caught kids up who missed class. They examined, like gave them exams, and they helped them promote to different classes, took care of classroom materials, like discipline. They kind of did everything. And so you have, again, not very professionalized teaching standards. You have like monitors sort of giving out like these kids. Kids are monitors who kind of like do what the teacher says. And usually they're taught the lesson just that morning. And just an extra kind of cool fact, kids wore like badges and got other prizes for small accomplishments, and they were demoted for their failures. I think it meant like you were moved back rows, which is pretty harsh for kids. And here's my source for that one down there. Another view of what a Lancaster school looked like. So like this is a picture, but you can see just like so many people. It was very discipline driven. And so back to like, how do we get to the structure? So schools are still decentralized and controlled by local townships, but they start to be publicly funded from the late 19th century, from like the mid 1800s to the late 1800s. You start to have state funding, and now you're starting to converge on similar schedules. Now, make sure I'm on the right slide. Now, early 1800s, you still have pretty agrarian farming communities, but usually like you farmed spring and fall were like the big farming months, and usually spring and winter you're kind of, or summer and winter you're off, but spring and fall was when you really had to work hard. At the same time, like urban schools were developing their own calendar for schooling, and so you had like New York that had 49 weeks of schooling, so almost an entire school year in 1842. And then Baltimore had 11 months of schooling in the 1840s. And then Philadelphia had 251.5 days, like a ton of school days back then. And so we're trying to go for some more cohesion. And this is where you first start getting summer breaks. And it wasn't what I thought it was, which was like, oh, people used to farm back then, so they had it off. That's actually not true. That's a total myth. Usually you didn't farm in the summer anyway, just because it was not the farming season. So what actually caused summer breaks to start was one, like social norms, which is wealthy and middle-class people would like bounce to like the suburbs and like to lakes and to out of the city during the summertime. And so kids wouldn't be in school anyway. They'd be with families. And then in addition, it was super hot in these buildings back then. So you didn't want to be in a school building in the summertime. It was pretty miserable. In addition, it was started to be a money thing. Because schools were starting to be publicly funded, it cost money to pay teachers throughout the summer and to pay like all the building upkeep. And so people who were paying for like local townships were like, I don't know if we still want to pay for it all then. And so like kind of with like budget cuts, like summer was an easy thing to cut because people were already out of town. It was really hot anyway. And then they also justified it with like, oh, like we'll get more teacher training in. We'll train teachers to be better. And so people bought in for that reason as well. And there's also this kind of push for like, people are frail and like their bodies need time to heal. And like, I'm on board for downtime for sure, but it seemed more like just like another justification for something that was already going to happen. Then, am I on the same slide? We'll see. And there's my source for that one. Yeah, so last thing for this one is, the last thing that really kind of pushed to this scheduling is that America's large cities had, by that time, already had major school districts consolidating. So cities, if you're in cities, all these kind of like smaller like neighborhoods were already sort of becoming one school district. And all cities with populations over 20,000 people had been consolidated into one school district by the early 1900s. And then rural districts sort of followed suit all the way to the 1950s. So you have these schools that are now getting in the same district who need the same schedule. And so summer breaks just kind of started to be a thing that made sense. And so through all of these factors, it wasn't like the farming thing that I thought it was. Through all these different factors, you start getting summers off and you start sort of building this traditional 108-day school year that now we still have today. And it wasn't because of like we had farming needs. It was just kind of because of coincidence. Like there were budget cuts, people were kind of scrambling year to year, and we're in the same structure today, which I find fascinating. Okay, so I'm at the 10-minute mark. So here's what I'm gonna do. Take a break, and you can do that by just like skipping ahead to the next part, because I'm gonna show you 1 minute of Hamilton to kind of break up my video. I'm not sure if it's a great idea, but enjoy or just skip ahead.
I'm on my way. There's a little surprise before supper and it cannot wait. I'll be there in just a minute, save my plane. Alexander, your son is 9 years old today. He has something he'd like to say. He's been practicing all day. Philip, take it away.
Daddy, look, my name is Philip. I am a poet. I wrote this poem just to show it. And I just turned 9. You can write rhymes, but you can't write mine. I practice French and play piano with my mother. I have a sister, but I want a little brother. My daddy's trying to start America's bank.
Take a break. For the summer, let's go upstate.
Eliza, I got so much on my plate.
We can all go stay with my father. There's a lake I know in a nearby pond. You and I.
So just so you know, that clip was random. If you'll notice, she said, well, we'll go upstate. It kind of refers to that thing I was talking about with, there we go. Referring to what I was talking about with people going upstate during the summertime. That's a tradition that in that time was in the 1800s. And if you watch Mrs. Maisel, it's also in that show as well. So it's a pretty common tradition with people who could afford so to kind of get out of town for the summer, which is why we started having schools get off during the summertime, because people weren't going to be there. All right, here's my part 2. So I've got 10 minutes on the clock for me, and then hopefully I'll keep this to another 10 minutes. Hopefully take a break and like ignore me for a second, and now we're going to dive back in. All right, so question 2 we're trying to answer right now is, so when did elementary, middle, and high school start? Like when did that structure start to be there? Because now we have schools that have sort of the same calendar year, but we don't know when that started. Because up till now we have, again, like these sort of Lancaster common schools where you're all kind of in one area. You're not really like delineated by, this age-based subject. You're just kind of in the same like all ages classroom space. So when did that change? This is a quote that this book is actually written by Salman Khan, the guy who makes Khan Academy. It was a pretty big inspiration for me doing new stuff this year. So if you're curious, I'll put a link up top for the book on Amazon. You could also just Google search it, it'll pop up. So if you're curious to buy it, it's a very good read. But I'm going to read this quote to you somewhat quickly. One of the leaps we need to make is to understand that the current dominant educational model was not, in fact, inevitable. It is a human construct. Parts of the system we know we now hold sacred, for example, the length of a class period or the number of years assigned to elementary or high school are in fact rather arbitrary, even accidental. And so that's what we're going to see in this next part is how did we get to this structure of elementary, middle, and high school? So again, in the late 19th century, so we're talking again, 1880s to the end of that century, there's a rethinking of high school subjects. At the same time that schools were starting to consolidate in the districts and get on the same calendar, there's a lot of frustration in the country with how many subjects were taught in high school. For example, like botany, zoology, and geology, which are all super cool, but for kids who are like, I'm not going to college, I don't need it right now, why do I have to learn this? And so you have this pushback. And so what happened in 1892, this Committee of 10, which was a very elite group of academics, like it included the president of Harvard at the time and the nation's Commission of Education. They came together with 8 other like elite scholars and made a lot of recommendations that really impacted the trajectory of education in the United States. Among those was primary schools lasting 8 years and secondary schools, which were seen as like college prep schools, lasting 4 years. Now, common school's already been teaching kids who are like 6 all the way up to 15. So common school structure already sort of followed that, like, okay, you'll stop around 14, which would be like when you're in 8th grade. So they already followed that structure. So the recommendation was pretty clever in that way. It already like met the norms of the time, but the structure had a pretty big effect. And you'll see that in 1909, the whole the whole Berkeley, California school district, so Berkeley, California, and Columbus, Ohio, actually had an official like restructuring and an invention of junior high, which your parents might know about this. I don't know how long that lasted, but there was a time where like K through 6 was elementary school, and then 7th through 9th grade was junior high, and then 10th through 12th, or sometimes just 10th and 11th were senior high. And so with this push, again, there's a lot of copycatting going on. So once Columbus does it and Berkeley do it, we see a lot of other school districts start to do the exact same thing. So they either adopt a 5-3-4, like 5 years elementary school, 3 years middle school, 4 years high school, or this 6-3-3, 6 years elementary school, 3 years of junior high, 3 years of senior high. And so then from 1910 to 1940 is what's referred to as the high school expansion movement, also called the high school movement or the secondary school expansion, where from 1910 to 1940, you have a lot of districts who are restructuring their students into these elementary, middle, and high school distinctions by their age. And this is a huge shift because it hadn't been happening before. It might have happened in some places, and there's some evidence that age-based populations were happening in common schools before this, but now we start seeing significant tangible structural shifts that largely happen because of this recommendation. And again, it's not like, this is not due to empirical evidence or like rigorous debate about what students can learn at certain ages. It wasn't about here are all the benefits of age-based schooling. It was just like, we just did it. Like we just went for it. And it just happened, and it was likely sparked by these recommendations and then just districts copying each other. If you're curious, here's a list of people who are on that committee of 10. And my source for that is the Khan Academy book and the Golden article. If you look at my sources earlier, you can find more out about it there. And then I'm actually, for your all's sake, since I'm already at like 15 minutes in the video, I'm not going to go over what was taught. I'm going to cut it for time's sake, but if you're curious about how math class structure began, it's really fascinating, so please ask me. And a small hint, it actually goes back to that same committee of 10 who first pushed for what math should be taught and when. Like they're the reason why you learned algebra starting in like late middle school and high school. It's because of them back to the 1892 committee. But I will pause on that, and if you're curious about it, please just ask me. And I'm going to go back to this because here's the big thing. I'm going to propose in a few videos you're going to watch before we start learning calculus, how we're going to learn. And it kind of goes back to this idea of, I think we haven't questioned the structure of schooling in a long time. A lot of things that we just take for granted, take as normal, haven't really been rethought. And so that's what I'm going to do this year. One, because we sort of have to in this new remote learning world, but then also I think it's going to work out really well. And that's kind of the basis for part of why I'm doing this. So I think I'm done with, if you have questions, again, shoot them my way. But if you're feeling it, keep going on the next video. And when you finish all of these, you'll get to dive into the first part of calculus.